The original Roller Coaster Tycoon, or RCT for short, came out on the 31st of March 1999. So today marks the 20th anniversary of the theme park management simulator that changed the tycoon genre and honestly changed my life as well. So I figured there'd never be a better time than now to revisit this draft script for a video essay that I wrote in early 2016 and ended up abandoning because I realized that it totally turned into one of these weird, overly pretentious video essays packed with unnecessarily verbose language. Also, a lot of videos about this game have come out since then, so I'm not too sure if I could contribute much of meaning to the public discourse. That said, it's the 20th anniversary of this game, and it's the very reason that I even have this YouTube channel. So there's a lot that I want to say about it from my own perspective, and at least I want to pay respect to it. So, if you're down for it, please allow me to gush about RCT for as long as I feel like, and in the meantime, I'm showing off some of my favorite parks and coasters that I've made throughout the years of playing the game scenarios, including the expansion packs. Part 1. What is Roller Coaster Tycoon? Roller Coaster Tycoon is a game that almost everybody has played or heard about, so I don't think it needs much of an introduction. It's a simulation game in which you try to build your own virtual theme parks across various maps in different scenarios, all while trying to reach the goals that the game sets for you, which usually revolve around attracting a certain number of guests to your park, but other objectives include getting a certain number of coasters done or reaching a monthly operating profit. The game was created by Chris Sawyer, who programmed the whole thing in x86 programming language. And I'm no programming expert, but I've heard that that is super impressive. Because while most programming languages exist to make programming more easy for humans, because the data that a computer reads is almost unintelligible to us, assembly is about as close as you can get to directly inputting commands into the hardware. This meant that the programming of Roller Coaster Tycoon must have taken a huge amount of time and effort, but it's also why the game works so well. A game from the 90s being able to simulate thousands of guests, roller coasters and rides all at the same time without lagging is really impressive, and to this day it still works really well on pretty much every system ever. In my opinion, a very underrated part of the game is the graphics. Usually people point out how they've aged quite well due to the pixelated 2D isometric perspective. But again, this is particularly impressive because it's all done by one person, Simon Foster, who 3D modeled many of the assets that you see in the game and rendered them from various perspectives in 2D to create tile sets which all of the roller coasters, rides and scenery that you see are made out of. He also has a YouTube channel with a really interesting video revealing how he made the tile sets, which I'll link down below in the description. Apparently one coaster type alone required 8,000 unique images just for the movement of the trains. And I can't begin to think about how much work it would have taken him to create all of the graphics for the game. Finally, Alistair Brimble, who made the game's sounds and music, rounds up the just about 3-man team that created the original game. I should also mention David Ellis, who according to the game's credits supplied additional sounds, and coincidentally he's quite well known within the roller coaster enthusiast community. He also has a YouTube channel with a lot of great roller coaster content, including some POVs that I'll link down below as well. As for the sound and music in the game, I think they've all sort of gone into the collective consciousness. I don't think I can ever hear this sound or this sound without feeling super nostalgic about it. The opening music is just as iconic, and really every time I hear a Johann Strauss Jr. waltz, I'm reminded of the merry-go-round soundtrack in RCT. As for the gameplay itself, it's very simple. Each level starts with a unique map and setting, and it's your job to lay down paths where guests can walk, place down rides and shops for them, and build your own roller coasters for them to ride and micromanage the out of all of it until you've successfully reached your objective ahead of the deadline. And I think that's what makes simulation games like this so good. Each level has a beginning and an end, but everything in between is up to the player. That said, something that RCT arguably does better than similar games like SimCity or Zoo Tycoon is allowing for player creativity, especially with the amazing coaster building tools. Part 2. Why Roller Coaster Tycoon is just so good. There are many videos already out there taking apart what makes this game so good. I'll link some in the description below. You get the drill by now, I hope. But to avoid repeating others, I'll try to highlight some of my favorite parts of this game that so far haven't received as much appreciation as they deserve in my opinion. Although in some ways, I guess I'm also kind of building on some of these other videos as well, so I highly recommend watching these as well, especially if you're interested in the game. If there's anything that most people seem to agree on, it's that what makes RCT so good is the perfect combination of management and creativity. The coaster builder and scenery options make it a perfect vehicle for creative expression, but the management of profits, guests and maintenance keep it engaging. DesignDoc has explained it better than I ever could, but there's a real sense of progression that makes the game as addicting as it is. Although, I do argue that this sense of progression doesn't just come from the ever-increasing profits and guest counts and other number-related things like that. They also come very much from everything else you do in the game. For one example, listen to what you hear when you just open up the first scenario. And now listen to what it sounds like when you've almost completed the scenario and you've managed to turn it into a successful theme park. As your park grows visually, the audio reinforces this sense of progression, and as your screen slowly fills up with rides and roller coasters, you'll hear more guests mumbling and rides rattling. They're very simple sounds, and on their own they're not very impressive, but I think that the way they work together to create this wall of theme park noise that gets louder and louder the more complex your park grows is really cool. You get positive feedback like this for every ride that you build. With more guests filling the park, your profit increasing, and even a rising park rating, along with the more and more completed look and feel of the park. Sure, you have complete freedom over what you want to build, but the game never lets go of its management, and for everything you build, it really feels like you're one step closer to the final goal. This is even true in a very literal sense. Coasters with more path interaction, difficult to design elements like interlocking loops, and overall more scenery, have a higher excitement rating and are therefore more profitable. So not only are they better from a creative standpoint, I suppose, but also from a management standpoint. Parks with a lot of well laid out theming will win rewards and attract more guests, and make the guests more happy as they're walking through the park as well. And the further you progress into the game, the more researched rides and themes you unlock, giving you more and more options to design your own parks. RCT isn't just a management sim made more engaging by adding a creative aspect on top of it. I think these elements are in many ways very much intertwined. That said, it's not perfect, and a pure focus on management can easily overpower any creative aspects of the game, at least in a visual sense. Once you know that all you have to do to win scenarios is to copy and paste the same shuttle loop layout over and over again, creating the most terrible but efficient theme park that honestly works in pretty much every scenario, the game is basically broken. Because of that, I do think you need to be willing to try and be creative, because otherwise it's very easy to cheese your way out of every scenario. In other words, because it's so open, it's really only as good as you're willing to make it as a player. For me, however, this combination of gameplay and creativity has always remained enjoyable, and no game since has been able to balance these elements quite as well, I think. And that includes the sequels and spiritual successors of the game. So yeah, Part 3, the sequels. Roller Coaster Tycoon became a huge success, and it was followed up by Roller Coaster Tycoon 2 in 2002 and Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 in 2004. On the surface, RCT2 didn't change the game that much. It was pretty much made by the same small team of developers. The graphics are almost exactly the same, and the gameplay didn't change much either. What made RCT2 so different from the predecessor was the introduction of the scenario editor, allowing players to create their own scenarios, and also more or less make a de facto sandbox mode. RCT2 later got expansion packs made by Frontier Developments, who went on to create Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 with some help from Chris Sawyer, but really Frontier as the designers of the game. This game was completely different from the first two, as it's in 3D, and it introduced a real sandbox mode, as well as the ability to ride roller coasters. Now, the ability to ride roller coasters basically changed the game forever and made it much more immersive than the predecessors, but the gameplay and roller coaster mechanics remained largely unchanged. Now, I won't say that any of these games is per se better or worse than any other. All three of them are amazing and they all have their own fans for good reasons. I do think it's interesting that some people, like me, prefer the first one over the other two, while a large number of people seem to think that RCT2 is clearly the best game because it adds a lot of content without removing anything that was already there. And the key difference is in why people play these games, I think. RCT2's greatest strength, the scenario editor, is also kind of its greatest weakness. Since you basically have god powers from the start, the game seemed to shift away from scenario mode as there are now less scenarios than the first game, and of course you get them all right from the start. That said, all of the new rides and scenery content totally makes up for it. More than RCT1 ever did, RCT2 allows the player to live the fantasy of designing their own theme park from scratch with almost any type of coaster or theme they could come up with. And honestly, I have yet to see any theme park simulator with as many coaster types as RCT2 had outside of the RCT franchise. There's a good reason why this game still has an active community to this day. It's just the most well-rounded isometric theme park simulation game. RCT1 is perhaps a better game, but RCT2 is undeniably a better creative tool. And honestly, if we consider unofficial RCT games too, I think OpenRCT2, which is a free open source version of RCT2 with online multiplayer mode, is probably the best game in the franchise. That said, I have a bone to pick with the RCT2 scenarios, so please hear me out here. By now we get the whole thing about creative play and management, but it wouldn't work so well without well-designed levels. And what makes the original RCT scenarios so good is not per se how nice they look, but the fact that there is, intentional or not, always a strong relationship between the objective that you're tasked with and the map that you're given. Forest Frontier is a quick one-year introduction scenario with a low necessary guest count, so it gives you a very small and open space with enough room to freely build, but not so much that it becomes overwhelming, and you can comfortably get used to how the game works and fill in the map in that 1 year. Rainbow Valley, on the other hand, is an infamous late game scenario because it forbids you from removing any trees or terraforming in any way, but it cuts you some slack by giving you a map with a river running through it where there will always be some kind of open space to build, even if it is quite difficult to work with. This interplay between a scenario's objective and the map it provides to reach it is an element which RCT2 too often misses the boat on for me. And I think it's the main reason why so many people dislike its scenarios, but aren't quite able to put their finger on why they feel that way. For me at least, it's why I prefer vanilla RCT1 over vanilla RCT2, and why RCT2 with RCT1 scenarios, in other words, Open RCT2, is the best thing ever. Now back to why RCT2 scenarios suck. There are some examples that always come to mind for me. So there's these two maps called Extreme Heights and Lucky Lake. The challenges for both of these parks are that their ratings are not allowed to go below 700, which is quite hard to do, and that both maps feature very difficult terrain, a hilly desert and a large lake respectively. But with unlimited money, there is no reason for Extreme Heights to have these hills or for Lucky Lake to be a lake, because in both cases, you can very easily just take your infinite money and completely flatten the land and come up with any kind of theme park that you want. Contrast this with Leafy Lake from the original game, for instance, where the lack of space around the lake actually puts forward a challenge to the scenario's objective. And I think it's clear to see why this scenario is often considered to be more fun. Now, to nuance this a bit and to show that I'm not just cherry picking these examples, RCT2 does do it right in some cases. Rainbow Valley's objectives, for instance, state that you cannot build above tree height, so the level design consists of huge hills that allow you to build large terrain-conforming coasters to fit with this height restriction. That said, I think this is a major reason why so many people feel like RCT1 scenarios are more memorable and more fun, but don't really know why they feel that way. Some things just right about the way the scenarios play out, because there's a connection between what the game gives you and what the game asks you to make. That, and the fact that you actually have to play the scenarios to unlock more, which is a pretty good way to get you motivated. And also the research department is actually necessary in RCT1 because you start out with only a few rides most of the time, unlike the majority of RCT2 scenarios where you're given way too many rides right from the start. I do like RCT2 though, just as much as the other games. I just think that the scenarios drop the ball in some ways, and maybe this is why some people prefer the original over the second one. The critical reception was also a little bit less good on the second game, but to be honest, I don't think this is really too relevant looking back now, because most of the criticism was that the second game didn't really add much to the first game and it was more of an expansion pack than a real new game. But to be honest, the original game is just that good. I can't really blame them for not changing anything about it. And finally, RCT3 arguably continued down the same path RCT2 went, and really just took it a step further. The game being in 3D and including a sandbox mode only made it more popular as a creative tool where you can design and ride your own roller coasters, and even walk around in your own theme parks. The game added tons of other content as well, like fireworks shows, water parks, and even animals, so you can build zoos in this game. Out of any of these games, this is probably the one that I spent most time playing, and I never really got tired of the sandbox mode because there's just so much content. And pretty much from 2010 to 2015, this is the game that I made videos of on YouTube, and this is the game that's sort of the reason that I'm even here and making this video right now. That said, people never really seem to play this game for the actual campaign mode. And even if I do think the career mode is kind of underrated and definitely really ambitious, it just doesn't live up to how tight the management in the original game is. Also, the graphics didn't really age well, even if this game was impressive when it came out. I might go back to this at some point in the future, if I get my disc back, and maybe I'll make some videos of some of the coasters that I never finished in this game. But that said, going back to this right now really doesn't feel as intuitive or friendly as going back to Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 or 2. There's just something about the strange, cartoony, very low poly style of 3D art that the game has. Part 4. What's next? It's hard to say what impact Roller Coaster Tycoon had on the simulation game genre 20 years ago. Obviously, it created a trilogy that remains popular and well respected to this day, but the last entry in this trilogy came out 15 years ago. What else did it bring since then? Okay, so just because I need to get this out of the way, there have been many attempts by Atari, who to this day own the rights to the franchise, to milk it for all it's worth. And I don't think there's anything I can say here that hasn't been said many times already. Aside from the ports, these games are all explicitly made to trick customers into buying them, because name recognition, I guess, while keeping their development costs as low as possible. Some of them are better than others, but they're all bad. I'm gonna list them all here just to get this over with, and so you know what not to spend your money on. There's Roller Coaster Tycoon 3D, Roller Coaster Tycoon for mobile, Roller Coaster Tycoon World, Roller Coaster Tycoon Touch, which is a port of Roller Coaster Tycoon World, and most recently Roller Coaster Tycoon Adventures, which is a port of Roller Coaster Tycoon Touch, which was a port of Roller Coaster Tycoon World. This time it's for the Switch, and then there's also Roller Coaster Tycoon Adventures for PC, which you can find on the Epic Games store, which is not something that we all have, but that's what it's limited to, unfortunately. And yeah, this game is a port of Roller Coaster Tycoon Adventures for the Switch, which was a port of Roller Coaster Tycoon Touch, which was a port of Roller Coaster Tycoon World. I hope we're all up to speed there. Honestly, I think at the moment there are really only two true spiritual successors to RCT. There's Planet Coaster, developed by Frontier and led by some of the people who worked on RCT2 and RCT3. And on the other hand, there's also Parkitect, which is a standalone indie game which takes a lot of inspiration from the original RCT, but it doesn't quite have the same connection to it. I don't want to dedicate too much of my time to these other games in a video which should be a celebration of Roller Coaster Tycoon, but in my opinion, anyone who wants to get back into this small genre of theme park sims should look into either of these two games. They're both great, for very different reasons, and maybe that's something I'll get into later. That said, they're pretty much the bulk of my channel, so I'm not too sure if I'm ready to make a comparison video of these. And honestly, I both love them equally for very different reasons. Anyway, that's it. I feel like there's a lot more I could say about this game, but I'm already procrastinating on my homework by writing this script now, so I'll leave it at this. Let me know what you loved about the original Roller Coaster Tycoon though, and I'll get back to making videos on whichever new RCT inspired game comes out.